Hello, my name is Zebulon Miracle. I'm a local historian, and one of my absolute favorite places in all of Mesa County and in all of western Colorado really is Sinbad Valley, a very remote but beautiful valley located right on the Mesa and Montrose County lines. I've titled today's talk, Collapse, Cattle and Copper, the Geology and History of Sinbad Valley. And so today we're going to take a very brief look at all three of those topics. Each one of these topics could go on for a talk in and of themselves. But what I hope to do is at the end of today's talk, inspire you to go down to Sinbad on your own, explore the local history, explore the local geology, and get to know one of my favorite places a little bit better. Now, for those of you that have never been to Sinbad Valley, again, it's located right on the Mesa and Montrose County lines, just a couple of miles in from Utah. And when you look at this valley, if you can see on the slide that we have here, it's kind of this kidney-shaped valley. It's very remote, very rugged, canyon walls that go up for almost 1,000 feet and then kind of a rolling flat bottom. There's about 3,300 acres of public land alone within Sinbad Valley, so it's quite sizable. But it's also, again, one of the most beautiful places and fascinating places that we have here. But to really talk about the story of Sinbad, we need to go back in time. So we're going to go back about 245 million years ago. On our screens right now, you should have a slide of what North America looked like 245 million years ago, quite different from what we see today. This is the beginning of the age of dinosaurs. And if you look carefully at this slide, you can see where north today is located, and right about where that north arrow is at is what's now modern day Kansas. And so if you go over just a little bit, you can see Colorado. And you'll notice a massive inland sea coming in, covering what's now parts of Idaho and Wyoming and a lot of Utah. And this is what our landscape looked like, and this is so crucial for how this valley was formed. For you see, about 250 million years ago, what's now Sinbad Valley, what's now western Colorado and eastern Utah, was on the edge of this large ocean. And so we would have waves and water come in and be isolated in pockets. And these pockets would be cut off from the rest of the ocean. That salt water in these trapped pockets would evaporate, the water would leave, and what was left behind is a thin layer of salt. And this would happen over and over and over and over again at this coastline. Salt water coming in, becoming trapped, water evaporating, leaving behind layers of salt. And again, this happens so many times that that thin layer of salt soon becomes very, 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 very thick. And so we're left with these huge pockets of salt. A lot of our geology in western Colorado, when you look at it, it's a very layer cake approach. You have the oldest rock on bottom, and then as you progress up through the layers, you get younger rock on top. And this is a photo from the Dolores River Valley, not too far away at all from Sinbad. And again, looking at this, we can see just layer after layer after layer, a very logical process. Old rock, you can see the differences in formations to younger rock progressively going. But when you go into Sinbad, it is far, far different. And that's because of that salt that we talked about. That salt creates collapsed salt domes. So salt comes, we talked about how those pillars of salt are created. Eventually the rest of the landscape forms on top and around. But we have these pockets of salt, and these pockets of salt will get water deposited in them from rain. And these pockets of salt become very buoyant, almost like a hydraulic lift. And so the salt will get water in it, the salt will push up on the landscape around it, will push up on the geology around it. You have a great representation of that in the slide right now. And you can just see that those rock layers going from those nice, pretty, easy to follow layer cakes to these really sharp angles. And eventually that salt dome collapses. And that's exactly what we get at Sinbad today. So when we look at this big kidney-shaped valley, when we look at some of the other canyons nearby, it's not a river that carved these, it's not a stream that carved these, but rather a collapsed salt dome. The photo on your right there is actually in Sinbad Valley. And I really like using this photo because in the background, you can see that layer cake geology, very obvious, but in the foreground, you can see that sudden rise up. You can see how that salt dome pushed and pushed and pushed, and then the collapse. So the geology of Sinbad is just absolutely fascinating. And when you go into Sinbad, there's one good road into Sinbad, but when you go in there, you see that layer cake geology all around you, and you turn a corner and you just see this jagged uplift of rock, and you see this wide open canyon, and you can't help but to wonder how it's been formed. And well, now you do. And what's amazing is it all has to do with an ocean that was here during the time of dinosaurs. This map that's on your screen right now shows a number of different canyons nearby. You can see Sinbad Valley up to the north, but just beneath it we have Disappointment Valley. Over in Utah we have Spanish Valley. We also have the Paradox Valley south of there. These are all collapsed salt domes. And if you look at each one of these canyons and valleys, you'll see they have the same orientation, going from the northwest to the southeast. And that's that ancient coastline collecting salt, building up these salt pillars collapse, and what we're left with is just this really staggering geology. Disappointment Valley is absolutely gorgeous as well, but Paradox Valley is another favorite of mine, a collapsed salt dome. So called because the Dolores River runs through the narrow part of the canyon instead of the wide part. It wasn't the Dolores River that carved that canyon or valley. Instead, it was a collapsed salt dome. When you get into Sinbad, you see not just the fascinating geology, but we also have fascinating paleontology, signs of ancient life. Again, being at the edge of an ancient ocean, we find numerous tracks in the area. Some of the best preserved are right off of the Salt Creek Road going into Sinbad. And these are tracks of little animals that lived here during this time that are closely related to crocodiles. And these tracks are fascinating. You can wander up to them. Some of them are about the size of your fist, and you can just see the individual toes and pads of the feet. And when you look at this artist representation of them, it's hard to believe this is what western Colorado and eastern Utah looked like 240 odd million years ago. But when we look at Sinbad today, here's another great photo showing that on the top, that jagged uplift and the collapse, and then you can see just how flat and beautiful that canyon bottom is. I had a job not far from Sinbad Valley, and one of my favorite things to do was go into Sinbad for lunch. I'd pack a little sandwich, drive the road into Sinbad, and just sit there and just watch the shadows play across the cliffs, listen to the birds. It truly is one of the most beautiful and quiet places in all of western Colorado. So again, I highly encourage you to go out there. But I have many great memories with a view just like this for an hour, 2 hours at a time, just enjoying watching the sun move and the clouds move and listening to the wildlife. So I highly encourage you to do the same. The first real written accounts of Sinbad Valley came from the Hayden expedition. The Hayden expedition came to this area in 1873, and they noted the salt deposits within Sinbad Valley. They also noticed a mining road had been built, probably in the 1880s, to reach gold placer claims. Now, for comparison, Grand Junction first has settlers come in 1881. Same thing with Delta and Montrose areas. So this is very early in western Colorado history. The fact that a wagon road went all the way from Ouray to there before the Hayden party really even got in there is absolutely incredible to think. The earliest account that I have of people going into the Sinbad Valley comes from a newspaper article out of Leadville from 1878. This is the Silver World, and they write, "An exploring party has returned from the Unaweep. They found a bed of pure white salt about 50 miles west of Ouray. To the west of us there seems to be almost everything. O.W. Jamison brought us a considerable quantity of salt from Sinbad Valley, 8 miles west of here. It is hard and fine grain. There is water in large quantities impregnated with salt. His opinion is that the only way to get it in quantity will be to evaporate it, which he says can cheaply be done. The salt he brought through to us, had evaporated without aid, and may be seen at our office at any time. So here in 1878, the interest was salt, actually getting pure salt out of Sinbad Valley. Eventually, though, the placer claims nearby, the gold mining claims, were of note. The earliest account that I could come across of true mining claims in the area are shown on your screen right now. There are 4 claims in Sinbad by a party of Jacobs, Young, and Locke in 1884, who sold their claims to a Pittsburgh company in 1866. There's also a party by the name of Nichols and Mahan, who found their specimens in 1896. So again, this is very early in Western Colorado history. So in our earliest days, our earliest decades of European and American settlement in this area, we had people going in looking for copper and looking for gold in the Sinbad Valley. These mines would eventually be developed quite extensively. This is a mining claim by John Nichols. This is for the Sinbad lodes 1, 2, 3, and 4, plus the Little Hope, the Bobtail lode, all of which were sold for $1,300 by Nichols to Mahan. This is one of my favorite aspects of studying history and something that I really hope to impart to you watching today. We can learn about history by looking at maps, by looking at newspapers, and also by looking at mining claims. So I'm hoping to show you an example of each throughout here. One of my big efforts is to make sure to show how we know about history. So when we say, hey, there was mining in Sinbad Valley, there's copper mining, there's gold mining, I want to show you where we learn that information. So here you see an example of a mining claim, one of our earliest mining claims in this area for the Sinbad Valley. So just a little note to keep out as we go through today's presentation about showing you where we learn history and where we find out about it. Now, those examples of mining claims and newspaper stories are great sources. We also have some more interesting sources that may or may not be true at times. One of the best books that I can recommend for anybody interested in Western Colorado history is a book called The Sinbad Minds, A Tale of the Rockies. This was written in 1905 by Dr. E.F. Eldridge. Now, Dr. Eldridge writes about everything from going to Salt Lake City to being enticed to coming to Western Colorado to going into Sinbad. And his accounts are very colorful, but also very interesting and might actually yield some great info. So, for example, Dr. Eldridge claims that they were one of the first parties to enter into the Sinbad Valley. They claim that they came across an abandoned cabin, and they even claim that they came across an abandoned copper mine. And over the front of the copper mine was written, the Prima Donna Mine. And it claimed that it was there for the Sinbad gold, silver, and copper lode. He has 2 names signed to it. He claimed that a John Conway and a Richard Rhodes first filed this claim on January 27th, 1861. This would be years before the Hayden expedition came through. This would be one of the earliest accounts of people actually settling down in Western Colorado for mining. I have not been able to validate that claim made by Dr. Eldridge. I have looked and I've looked for this John Conway. I've looked and looked and looked for Richard Rhodes and other records. I'm not disagreeing or going in contrary to what Dr. Eldridge said, but this is a fun example about how sometimes we find something in an old book, an old manuscript, something going off of memory, and have to really start to judge and debate and start pressing through. But if Dr. Eldridge is correct, that would be, as far as I can tell, the oldest claim made of any type outside of the San Juan area in Western Colorado. Now, I do have to take a little bit of what Dr. Eldridge writes with a grain of salt. The best way to get into Sinbad Valley is to follow the Salt Creek Road. It is an absolutely gorgeous road. You turn away from the Dolores River Valley. You start going up this very narrow, rugged canyon. The walls really come in close. It is just a breathtaking drive. Highly recommended in dry weather. Don't try to attempt it when it's muddy. But the canyon walls come in close and close and close. And I came across this written, this statement written by Dr. Eldridge. So Dr. Eldridge writes this about traveling through the Salt Creek Valley. Upon entering the canyon, although it was but a little after noon, as they gazed through the crevice over their heads, they were astonished to see no stars shining above. This phenomenon was due to the great depths of the canyon and the fact that nearly all light, except from above, was excluded from it. So imagine that Dr. Eldridge is claiming this canyon is so narrow and so large that it blocks out the sun enough that you could see the stars in the middle of the day. Now, sadly, unless Dr. Eldridge was there during a total eclipse, I doubt that was the case, but you can just see that romanticized idea of how rugged and how remote of a place this was. So I encourage you, take the drive through Salt Creek, look up high, see if the stars are out in the middle of the day or not. But Dr. Eldridge's account is absolutely fascinating. He writes a lot about the earliest mines in the area for copper mining. Again, I highly encourage you to check it out. You can easily find it online. It's a very easy book to find digital copies of, and it just paints a great account of Western Colorado. Now, Dr. Eldridge might have been one of the first parties into the area, but many soon followed. On your screen now is a certificate of incorporation for the Sinbad Mines and Reduction Company, who was created in 1905 and capitalized at $1 million, or $1 per stock for their 1 million shares. We can see another mining deed here. We can see that the Sinbad Mines and Reduction Company were sold for $666,000, and the same Mr. Mahone that we talked about earlier became president. And finally, we can see some more speculation in copper mining from this Daily Sentinel article from March 25th, 1907. In it, this talks about the Sinbad Mines and Reduction Company having a board of directors of Dr. Eldridge, who we talked about earlier, John J. Lumsden, who Lumsden Canyon outside of Gateway is named after, and A.D. Mahone, who we've talked about quite a bit already. So you start seeing some of the names tied together, buying mines, selling mines. It's pretty interesting to see. We can also see that the names of the mines in the area really harken back to 1001 Arabian Nights. We have the Baghdad mine and the Sinbad mine, and of course, Rock Creek is just the next canyon south. Rock being the eagle that the sailor Sinbad has to outwit in 1001 Arabian Nights. There's also an ad from 1907, or this ad also states that there is, quote, known to be a very high grade, and the only requirements to put this property on a paying basis is the reduction plant, which we are now putting in. This entire ad that we're showing right now sells itself as an article, but really when you start reading it, you can see a lot of land speculation in here. This article goes on saying, quote, never was there such a time as these for making money, and no single industry in the world is now paying as large a profit on the amount of money invested as the copper industry. No single field of activity as this is making fortunes so rapidly, particularly for men and women in the United States. The Sinbad Mines and Reduction Company's properties offer an opportunity for investments which cannot be found elsewhere, where so little money will secure an interest in a property which contains all the elements of success. Our company has just led a contract for a smelting plant, and when this plant is in operation and producing, it will produce at least a net profit of $5,000 per day. So you can see they're definitely trying to entice investors. Would that reduction plant ever actually do up to $5,000 a day? Most likely not, but tracing newspaper articles, tracing mining deeds is an interesting way to see how the area was developed. Dr. Eldridge would pass away in 1916. And again, when you read his book, The Minds of Sinbad, he talks about his trips to Europe. He talks about going to Grand Junction, talks about going back into Sinbad after it had been largely established as a copper mining area. So again, I highly encourage you to read that. It's a fascinating tale, not just of Sinbad, but of Western Colorado overall. One particular mine I'd like to talk about, though, is the Copper Rivet mine. This was a copper mine when you first enter into Sinbad Valley. It's off to the north, off of the Salt Creek Road. And here you see a couple of articles from the Daily Sentinel and the Montrose Daily Press and Montrose Enterprise talking about that mine. From these articles, we can glean that in 1914 it was incorporated, and it claims that there are 300 acres with 16 claims that were staked and shafts driven from 100 to 150 feet. The big goal at the time, though, was to get the Southwestern Pacific Railroad to come down through Unaweep Canyon. This is a major problem that we see in a lot of mining all over the country. You might have the minerals, you might have the materials, but without a cheap way to transport it out, those mines become very costly. It becomes very, very expensive to mine. So one common plea that we see throughout is this push to have more transportation in the area. These articles also claim that in 1915, ore was running at $5,000 per ton, and that a 400-foot tunnel had been put in at the Copper Rivet mine. And then 2 years later, in 1917, at their annual meeting, they claimed that there were 14 copper and silver claims, and that over $5,000 was spent on a cross-cut tunnel 500 feet below the surface. Now, this is quite a mining operation. We're talking several different tunnels, several different shafts going hundreds of feet. This would have required a lot of capital. But again, if you're able to entice enough people that you're getting $5,000 per ton, you could maybe entice investors. Now, the Copper Rivet also had a reputation for salting. That is, you would have an investor come out and tour the mine, or a potential buyer, and you would lay out some really, really high quality ore, and you just happen to find that right at the surface and convince that buyer or that investor, hey, look, you just have to walk and you can find material here. The Copper Rivet ended up having quite a reputation for that, and after reading some of these newspaper articles, you can kind of start to see why, at least a lot of big claims. But we'll talk a little bit more about that salting here in just a little bit. Now, this is what the Copper Rivet looks like today. So the view from the Copper Rivet mine as you climb up above the entrance to Sinbad from Salt Creek is absolutely breathtaking. You can see for miles and miles and miles. You just have this commanding view of Sinbad Valley and Salt Creek. And you can see on the photo on the right, you can see this is the Copper Rivet #1. There's quite a bit of old material there, but the Copper Rivet is also being used today. Now, I will take a quick chance here to tell you never, ever, 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 under any circumstance, enter into an abandoned mine. There is nothing in there worth your life, and I guarantee you are risking your life to a high degree entering an abandoned mine. But this is what the entrance to the Copper Rivet looks like. So again, you can see on the left, this is Copper Rivet #1, and there is a large gate there, fortunately, and I was able to get my camera just right to where you can start seeing into that shaft. And if those articles from 1915 and 16 and 17 are correct, there might be 400 feet of tunnels back here. Not an area worth exploring, very unsafe, very unsound. One interesting story about this entrance, though, is, and you can see it in the photo if you look carefully, but this gate was put in to keep people out, but they're also doing a bat study in that area. And when you peer through that gate and you look into this endless tunnel, this endless abyss, you can't help but to feel a little queasy as far as what it'd be like to be locked on the wrong side of the gate. And so if you look in that photo on the right-hand side, you'll see something shiny, and that's a key to the lock. So that if, heaven forbid, you did get locked, that gate locked behind you, you at least have that key to get yourself back out. But I can't imagine what a terrifying feeling that would be. So please, don't experience it on your own. Stay out of abandoned tunnels for sure. Now, as I was exploring the Copper Rivet, I also found the remains of several stone cabins and an old camp at the base. These stone cabins and piles of trash and corrals are all artifacts. So please, if you happen to stumble upon this or any other site of archaeological importance or historic significance, take only pictures, leave only footprints. Please do not take anything. Every little bit of this site is a clue to our past and something we all share. But wandering around these cabins was absolutely fascinating to see. And so I couldn't help but wonder when I was there, who lived here? Who's tied to this? Who had Sinbad Valley as their home, and who lived at the base of the copper rivet mine? So again, wanting to show you a little bit more as far as what historians do to understand and answer some of these questions. This is a map from the General Land Office. This is an organization, a government agency that went out and mapped the West for homesteading. This map was filed on November 17th, 1903. And when you look at it, you can see the heart of Sinbad Valley. You can see our kidney-shaped valley. To the northeast, you can see the Salt Canyon Road. And then the far east of the map is just labeled unsurveyable. It was just such a rugged, remote country. But that canyon bottom, the bottom of Sinbad Valley, they were able to go through and actually do some surveying work on. And when we get really close on some of these maps, we can see historic trails, we can see water sources, we can see old roads. And if we look really, really carefully, you can see Joe Adams' cabin right at the mouth of Salt Canyon and right at the entrance of Sinbad Valley. I think it's fair to say that those cabins, those stone cabins, belonged to Joe Adams. And so I was curious to know more about who Joe Adams was. And so we're able to use the GLO maps, the General Land Office maps, to figure out who was there. But then I was able to dive into the 1910 U.S. Census. And in the 1910 U.S. Census, I came across a Joseph Adams in Colorado. You can see some of the highlights of the census record. In 1910, he was 45 years old, meaning he was born around 1865. He was born in Michigan. He was single. His mother and father's birthplace was Ireland. And his occupation in 1910, so just a couple years after that map was filed, he's listed as a miner in the copper industry. So it's probably fair to assume that that was indeed Joe Miner's cabin and that he was probably working the copper rivet mine. It says that he was able to read and write and that he also owned his own home. Going another step farther, using another tool that's available to you through the library. So I was able to do a search on oral histories related to Joe Adams. And I came across one that was made in 1975 with Fred Ames. Fred Ames was a legendary rancher in that area. And so I'm just going to read to you briefly what he had to write about the copper rivet and about Joe Adams. So Fred Ames says, quote, "I think he came in there around 1900. He was there until he got to be quite an old man. He really didn't do any work on the mine himself. He just leased it to people. And the ore wasn't good enough to pay for the shipping. So these people he leased it to would work it long enough to find that out and find out that it didn't pay, and then they would just drop it. He would restake it, and he always had plenty of money from selling the mine. He would go to the St. Regis, a hotel here in Grand Junction, again, but it was there that he had a stroke or something, and he didn't die, but some of his folks came and picked him up and took him back east." So again, I really, one of the big purposes of this talk is to show you how we understand what we know about history. So we're able to look at a map from the General Land Office to get an idea of whose building that was. We were able to take a look at census records to find out if that person was indeed in the area. And then we're able to look at oral history records to help flesh out that character, help flesh out that person. So we go from Joe Adams, a spot on a map, to Joe Adams, the son of Irish immigrants who came to western Colorado and mined for copper. And then listening to oral histories, you get an idea of him coming up to Grand Junction to stay at the St. Regis to surround himself with a little bit of comfort, and then eventually becoming ill and moving back east. So again, all these are fun tools that historians can use, and you can use these as well, especially through the library. They have tremendous resources for you to use. I mentioned roads. Again, roads were a dominant issue reading the development of Sinbad. The easiest way to get into Sinbad was actually up from the south. Today, the easiest way from Grand Junction to get to Sinbad is to take Highway 141 south and drive through Gateway, and you're there in no time. During that time, though, the road through Unaweep Canyon was quite remote and quite rugged. I think that's one of the most beautiful drives in the entire state, and one that's maybe a little underappreciated. But until these mines opened, especially until the Pyramid Mine opened, Sinbad Valley was almost too remote and too difficult to drive through. I have on the screen right now some newspaper articles from the Daily Sentinel dating from 1901 all the way up to 1919 about this push and this need for roads in the area and the need to develop a route from Grand Junction down to Sinbad. And it was because of these efforts, and again, especially because of the efforts of the Pyramid Mine, that we eventually get a system of roads leading not just to Sinbad, but also in Sinbad itself. In 1904, the Grand Junction Chamber of Commerce was pushing for a road in Sinbad from Grand Junction to Sinbad. And a gentleman by the name of John Brown said that he could build the road from the Sinbad to the mouth of West Creek for about $2,000. In 1901, even before that, there were talks of the Rat Nest Mine needing roads because they had shipments of ore ready to go, but they couldn't get it out of the canyon to find a buyer. And in 1919, we have officials coming down surveying the ore, saying that the Sinbad Valley could be one of the most productive places in the world if only a feasible roadway could be found. And again, it was largely the investments of the Pyramid Mining Company that made that possible. A lot of what you drive today on Highway 141 is the result of investments made by the Pyramid Milling and Mining Company. On the screen now is a plat from July 2nd, 1906. So this is the mining claim that the Pyramid Company has in Sinbad Valley. And you can see the individual mining claims that all make up the Pyramid Mining Company's empire in that area. As we zoom in on that, if we get a little bit more detail on this plat, you can see again the individual mining claims. But you can also see that they have some houses, a cabin, an excavation area for a mill site. This was quite a development, and this is all in the northwest section of Sinbad Valley. This is the view from the Pyramid Mine. I was able to go with a friend there a couple of years ago. We followed some very rugged roads and eventually just had this great view. And this is taken basically from the Pyramid Mine. And this is one of the entrances to the actual Pyramid Mine, or one of several of the entrances to the mines itself. Again, do not ever try to attempt an old mine. You will die. It is not worth it. So these photos were only taken from the outside, and I can tell you these timbers might very well be from 1906. I'm not going to trust them to hold up the hillside above them, but it was still a fascinating view into this mine. This is probably the Derby number 2 entrance that we're looking at. A much more difficult drive was along the bottom portion. So the mines itself, where they're taking out ore, was up top, and then using gravity, they would send the ore down to a mill where that material would be crushed up. In finding the mill, we knew the mill existed because we saw it on that plat, and we could basically make it out through binoculars from the top, but to actually get to the bottom was quite a day. But you can see the remains of this massive, massive mill that was made by the Pyramid Mining Company. It was quite a day to go down there, and again, if you are able to go and experience any of these sites, please, please, please take nothing. Please, please, please be careful getting there, and please respect private property. This is a map that was made in 1952 of mines in the area. This is from a publication called Investigation of the Colorado Copper Company Properties. And you can see Sinbad Valley, our kidney-shaped valley on the left. You can see Salt Creek going in, and you can see numbers denoting where the different copper mines were located. Again, a lot of these copper mines are inactive today. Again, please be careful, visit with respect, and also respect private property. But you can see how Sinbad Valley, copper industry was just so important for it in its earliest days. But switching gears, I'd like to talk a little bit about the ranching in the area. Now, I won't have the opportunity to talk about every ranching family that went into Sinbad, but I would like to at least give you an overview of ranching. The bottom of Sinbad lends itself really well for cattle grazing. It's easy to have cattle go out, and they're largely hemmed in, which is nice. But we have a number of large ranches that were established in the area. These are newspaper articles from the Grand Junction News and the Daily Sentinel, going clear back to 1886 all the way up to 1913, talking about ranchers taking a trip through the LaSalle and Sinbad Valley country looking for cattle, or this 1888 article about a roundup along the Dolores River. And even in 1913, we see how the Sinbad Valley is listed as being a very picturesque stock ranch. So ranching has always been crucial for Western Colorado industry, and Sinbad Valley is no exception. This is that same map that we talked about earlier, that General Land Office map of the base of Sinbad Valley, the bottom, the canyon bottom. And you can see some roads leading to the north. And if you look carefully, you can see one of our earliest cattlemen to be in the area, the man by the name of John Brown. Now, this isn't the same John Brown as Civil War fame that you hear about. Rather, this John Brown moved to the area in the 1880s, and he has one of the first homesteads in the area. This is a notification that John Brown successfully homesteaded on land, and this is from 1901. And here's another view of that homestead record showing what land was deeded over to John Brown. For me, John Brown's one of the most fascinating characters in Western Colorado and Eastern Utah history. We see him show up in Sinbad Valley in the 1880s. He has this land deeded to him by the U.S. government in 1901. And we saw earlier an account of him telling the Chamber of Commerce that he could build a road from Sinbad up to West Creek for about $2,000. You see John Brown in a lot of oral histories. There's a story of him hauling a big boiler to the Pyramid mines. We have his connection to copper mining. There's stories of him using teams of horses to try to pull up an entire lumber mill up the side of Sinbad to get to the top. And just John Brown is a legend in local history. Now, sadly, as a legend, there's some stories about him that just kind of became, well, just that, legends. And one of the things that I really enjoy doing is trying to find out the truth behind some of our local characters. So one of the most famous stories about John Brown is told quite a bit, and I've heard many, many variations of it, but I wanted to get down to the heart of it to find out what was true. And so I'm going to tell you the story about John Brown, perhaps the most famous story of John Brown. And again, this is all based off of some historic research that I've had the pleasure to do. So what we know about John Brown is he comes to Sinbad Valley, he homesteads, he's involved with copper, he's involved with transportation, he's involved with lumber milling. He's very much an entrepreneur, very much involved with numerous things. And eventually John Brown becomes quite wealthy and quite successful, and so he kind of outgrows Sinbad Valley, outgrows the Gateway area. And so he moves over the hill, over the LaSalles to the Moab region. And in Moab, he becomes a county commissioner. He owns several different businesses. He's still involved with ranching. He's married, he has 2 kids. Things are going really, really well for John Brown until one night in 1911. In November of 1911, there's a big dance in Moab. The entire community's there. Brown's there. He's there with his 2 daughters. And Brown is doing so well with everything, but he cannot stand his son-in-law, a gentleman by the name of James Dubois. And at this dance in 1911, Brown becomes so outraged at his son-in-law, James Dubois, that during this big party, during this dance, the 2 of them get into a fight. The family breaks up the fight and decides nobody's having any fun, so let's leave. So the party starts leaving and going back to the Brown Ranch. They start walking down the main drag of Moab. But Brown becomes so outraged at his son-in-law that he goes up to a picket fence, and he tears off a picket, and he starts beating James Dubois in the middle of the thoroughfare. Well, the family steps in again and goes, John, you're obviously very upset. Why don't you take the wagon? Why don't you head on home? We'll walk. It's not very far. But why don't you just go and calm down? So Brown leaves. But instead of calming down, Brown grabs 2 Winchester rifles. He then goes back to his son-in-law, James Dubois, and says, we're finishing this now. And he gives a rifle to his son-in-law. The two of them get into a bit of a scuffle, and John Brown's daughter, James Dubois' wife, steps right in front of the gun just as Brown raises it. Brown fires. The bullet goes through her heart, killing her instantly, and continues through her and hits James Dubois in the gut. With one shot, John Brown kills his daughter and his son-in-law. Now, it sounds too good to be true. Well, maybe not too good to be true, maybe too fanciful to be true. But this is the front page of the Grand Valley Times, the local Moab newspaper, from November 24th, 1911. And you can see the headline says, husband and wife shot to death by father. And it talks about James Dubois dying 3 hours later and the daughter dying almost instantaneously. One of my favorite quotes out of this newspaper, and pardon me for the language in advance, but one of my favorite quotes comes from the middle column. Eventually, Brown surrenders to the sheriff, and he says, I killed my girl accidentally, but I killed that son of a bitch of a man on purpose, and I don't care who knows it. Brown would then go to trial. The next summer, he had to listen to the funeral service of his daughter from his jail cell. That trial the next summer up in Price, Utah, Brown presents his side of the case, that both of them were equally armed and that he was defending his daughter's honor. After a couple of hours of deliberation, the jury comes back and finds John Brown not guilty, as you see here. Brown then goes back to Moab. People basically looked the other way. He resumes a lot of his businesses and dies in Grand Junction in the 1930s, essentially of old age. Today, John Brown Road connects Gateway to Moab. It's a beautiful drive. I highly encourage it. That was built in the 40s for the uranium and timber industry. When they built it, they basically said, well, we need to name it after somebody. What about that rancher from down the road? So in our story, perhaps the villain is the one that gets something named after them. But this whole story about John Brown, remember, it gets its start right at the base of Sinbad Valley. So looking at maps and seeing some of these names over and over, what my biggest passion, one of my biggest joys is taking just a random place name and actually finding out that story behind it. And so now you know the story of John Brown Road, and next time you're in Sinbad, just imagine John Brown starting his homestead there and what that would eventually lead to. The whole Gateway, Moab, Paradox, Sinbad area was well known for different cattle thieves and different outlaws. This is just a quick one of many articles I was able to find about cattle theft in the Gateway area and along the Dolores River. In fact, the eastern flank of Sinbad Valley is a mesa with a very colorful name. This story goes that cattle thieves would run cattle to this very remote mesa on the eastern flank of Sinbad. And up there, these thieves would take a knife and cut out the cow's brand, put on a new piece of leather, sew that new piece of leather on, and rebrand the cow. And so today that mesa is known as Sew 'em Up Mesa, because that's where the cows were resewed with a new brand. So our entire region is really well known for cattle thieves. We also have some connection to the famous McCarty gang. This is a photo of Butch Cassidy's gang, the Wild Bunch, who possibly used Sinbad Valley as an escape after they robbed the Telluride Bank in 1889. There's some evidence that they used the canyon through Sinbad. But one of the associates of Butch Cassidy and one member of the Wild Bunch was Tom McCarthy. And even after his days with the Wild Bunch, Tom McCarthy went on to try to rob the bank in Delta. This is a photo of the unsuccessful results of the robbery of the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Delta, Colorado on September 7th, 1893. Tom McCarthy enticed his brother to come along, and his brother brought his son, so Tom's nephew. Both of them were shot in the incident, and you can see the photo of them propped up against the store wall. Again, that story alone deserves a talk on its own, but we do know that Tom McCarty had family in Sinbad, and a lot of people refer to one of the cabins in Sinbad as possibly being the McCarty cabin. And so this is one of the other challenges as a historian. Did Tom McCarty actually use that cabin? Maybe. We know that he had family in the area. We can look at relatives of his had land in Sinbad. We can see it as a logical place to go. Now, can I tie that cabin to a specific time of Tom McCarty being there, or was it used after this, or did Butch Cassidy go there? Sadly not. But we can say that presumably Sinbad Valley and perhaps that cabin did have associations, and we can see that through looking at marriage records and looking at time that he was in the area. Can I specifically say Tom McCarty used this cabin or Butch Cassidy used this cabin after this event? Not yet. But that's also part of the fun of being a historian, is we have the opportunity to further research things. This is a map of, or I should say, this is a list of homestead records in Sinbad Valley. So that is land that was given by the U.S. government to homesteaders, people that came, worked on the land, filed a small fee, and were eventually given up to 160 or later 320 acres of land because they were the first to use it in development. Our earliest homestead on this record was John Brown in the early 1900s, and the last is one of the Ames from 1940. Now, this isn't a complete list of people that settled in Sinbad Valley. Rather, this is a list of individuals who received free land, if you will, from the federal government. Oftentimes in an area like Sinbad, you might have a family not get the full homestead, not actually have the land deeded over to them. So this isn't a comprehensive list of people that stayed in Sinbad. Rather, this is a list of people that actually received a homestead, actually received land from the federal government. The earliest real record that I could find in Sinbad, at least in Mesa County, is this. This is a record for water use. It is a statement of claim to water right. Water is everything, right? The famous saying, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, right? And that's true even in a place like Sinbad. It's great land for grazing as long as you get the water where it needs to go. There are a lot of springs in Sinbad. There's access to Rock Creek to the south if you were to drill through one of the mesas. There's water, it's just a matter of getting that water where it needs to be. And so that was some of the earliest struggles. This claim that I have to water right shows that these several springs in the area were going to be developed. And the plan on this, a gentleman by the name of Maxwell filed this claim with the idea of digging a ditch, 1/2 mile ditch from the Sinbad Spring to the Clear Creek to his ranch. And we can also see when we look at these General Land Office maps from later on, you can see Sinbad Valley and you can see a number of springs listed and a number of irrigation ditches dug. Perhaps the largest, most ambitious claim or water project was undertaken by Irving Ames. He surveyed a ditch and a reservoir in 1910 with the idea of bringing water from Rock Creek, which is the first canyon south of Sinbad. And the plan was to drill through the mesa, going some 7,212 feet in length and creating a ditch 2.5 feet deep and 8.25 feet wide for an estimated cost of $10,000. The story goes that Ames started on this ditch. He started drilling through the separation between Sinbad and Rock Creek, and there he hit water. He hit basically an aquifer, and that water is still used today to irrigate most of Sinbad Valley. So there is an abundance of water. It just takes a lot to get it there. When you tour through Sinbad today, again, please be respectful of private property. Please be careful. Please know what you're getting yourself into. Road conditions can change drastically, so please be safe. But one of the big landmarks in the northeast section is the Garnet Cabin. And here you can see a before and after of the Garnet Cabin. You can see it's actually held up fairly well over the years. And again, I love being able to see a building or to see a name and actually develop the story of who that is. And we use that by looking at historic records. And so what we know about the Garnets is that we know that John Garnet came to the Gateway area around 1910, and he did some mining on Dolores Point, and there he claims that he met Marie Curie, the famous French scientist, which, as far as I can tell, Marie Curie was never in our area, but we oftentimes hear from miners related to radium that they met Miss Curie. Eventually, John Garnet marries a woman by the name of Gertrude Bickford, and he met her in Price while he was running some cattle, and eventually they end up in Sinbad Valley, and there they start a family. There John works for the Pyramid Mine Company, and he would take the long walk over to the pyramid every day, but he also had a daughter, and you can see a nice photo of her here. She was actually born in that cabin and moved when she was less than a year old, and they eventually ranched along the Dolores River. And so again, I love when we come across these. I know people watching this talk today won't think of these as simply ruins or trash, but sadly there are a lot of people that do, and I love being able to say, no, this isn't just a pile of rocks and broken sticks. Instead, this is where somebody lived, and this is where somebody had hopes and dreams and ambitions. This is where John and Gertrude had their first daughter here. This is where John would walk and work at the Pyramid Mining Company every day. And what I really enjoy doing is taking these historic sites and hopefully making them come alive for people. And when we look at the Garnet Cabin, there's a photo of how the cabin looks today, but just looking on the surface, we're able to find some evidence of him working at the mine. You can see a Union Carbide canister over there that would have helped provide light for him while he was in the mines. And so it's really fun when you see these and have it all tie together. The final little bit of Sinbad that I'd like to share, and one of my favorite tools for research, are post office records. So believe it or not, Sinbad had a post office, and the first listed post office comes from 1914, and there they had mail once a week delivery up to Gateway. Joe Adams, gentleman that we first talked about, who had the stone cabins, there's an oral history story about how he would send out junk ore samples through that post office. And the reason why he sent out junk samples of ore was to justify the post office being there, to say that they had enough freight moving through. And so now all of a sudden, let's think back to that story about how the Copper Rivet mine had a reputation for salting claims and had this reputation of trying to entice donors or entice investors or buyers using junk claims and junk rock. Well, maybe that story's gotten jarbled over the years. Maybe instead, Joe Adams is actually a good guy who wanted to build a community and realized that the post office is a foundation for a community. So maybe the story of salted claims actually comes from Mr. Adams sending out junk rock just to keep the post office justified. So it's really fun in retrospect over 100 years later saying maybe there's a different wrinkle to this story. Maybe there's a different case. Eventually, Irving Ames, the gentleman that tried digging the irrigation ditch between Sinbad and Rock Creek, became the postmaster. And there's a great story of him using his Model T to navigate in and out of the valley. So again, each of these areas, when you go into Sinbad today, it's going to look like one of the most remote places. But remember, 100 years ago, this was home for people, and still is today. They're still ranching in the area. This is a photo of, or a map, I should say, of what the Sinbad area looks like today. This is just the Mesa County section of it, but you can see the different colors on this map. The lighter colors are private property, so you can see a lot of Sinbad is private property. You can see there's a lot of ranching going on there still today. So I talked about that in the past tense of people still having their dreams and hopes and living everyday life there, but it still is something that continues today. So when you do go to Sinbad, please be careful because its story isn't finished being told. There still are people working that land. There still are active mining claims. There still are people running cattle, but it's still a fascinating place to go and to see and to explore There's still a lot of work being undertaken to understand the geology of the area. UTEP, the University of Texas, El Paso, is doing field work down there right now to better understand the geology. There's still natural history investigations about the bats that live in the copper mines. And there's still a lot of historic research to be done. So, like I said, the story of Sinbad isn't complete yet. The story of Sinbad goes from ancient floodplains and being on the edge of a coast to this massive collapse of a salt dome, to creatures that look like crocodiles leaving behind their footprints, to copper mining, to ranching, to families coming out and having children and still finding a way to work at the mines to provide, to ranchers trying to get water where it needs to go, to today people still having their livelihood and their dreams dependent on the land. So when you go there, understand that it's not a dead story, it's not a story that's finished, rather it's a story that is still continuing. But even today, we're investigating how it came to be and what all happened there. And that's one of the things that makes Sinbad one of my favorite places to explore. So if you're able to, I highly encourage you to go down, stay safe, visit with respect, visit with care. But if you're able to make it into Sinbad, I promise it's a trip you'll never forget. And as you drive down Salt Canyon Road, take a look up and see if you can see the stars or not. Thank you very much.